Hey there folks, welcome to video number 12, this one on new immigration in the United States. We're going to be focusing on the millions of new immigrants who are coming to the United States between the years 1880s and 1920s, as well as taking a look at what they encountered when they arrived in places like New York City, Boston, Chicago, and the rise of other urban areas in the United States. So let's get going. So before we can talk about new immigration, you need to understand what old immigration was. Well, old immigration would fall in the time period from 1776 till about the Civil War, the 1860s. And most of these immigrants came from Western and Northern Europe, countries like England, Scotland, Ireland, and even Germany. Many of them spoke English. Even some of the Germans who came over could speak at least a little bit of English. And most of them were skilled workers, laborers with some level of education. Many of them were Protestant Christians, so they were Anglican, they were Baptist, they were Methodist, they were Presbyterian. And the one exception were the Irish, who were largely Catholic. But overall, the cultures they came from easily integrated within the United States. The political system, a lot of what people read, the language people spoke, the music, a lot of political and religious beliefs were already in the United States. So it was easy to kind of fit in and find other people who you could agree with, even if you came from a different country. And here's a breakdown that shows you where people lived and where they came from. So you can check out the pie chart, you can check out the other graph to find out where these old immigrants were settling. So let's take a look at the new immigrants now. So new immigrants, or new immigration, is during the time period from the 1870s to the 1920s. And we're going to see a big change in where immigrants are coming from to the United States and the effect they're having on the United States. And they differed from the old immigrants in that they came mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe instead of Western and Northern Europe. So now they're coming from places like Italy, Russia, Poland, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And we're talking about millions, about 20 million in total came from all of these countries. There are also a lot coming from Asia. There are about 500,000 total who came from places like China, Japan, and Korea. A lot of them settled on the West Coast. From Mexico and the Caribbean, there were about 1 million immigrants to the United States. And these people spoke languages that were very different from English, especially Asian languages, very different alphabet, very different pronunciations and expressions. So it made it very difficult for a lot of them to make that adjustment. A lot of them were also unskilled laborers who didn't have much education. They were coming to the United States because they wanted new opportunities. They wanted a chance to survive because they weren't doing well in their home countries. And many of them weren't doing well because they didn't have access to education. Many of them were also Catholic, and many of them were Jewish. Those coming from Russia, those coming from Eastern Europe, were for a big chunk of them were Jewish, and they were escaping religious persecution. A lot of the folks who came from Italy were Catholic. Italy is, after all, where the Vatican is, where the Pope lives. And for those coming from Asia, many of them were Buddhist, which in the United States was a very rare religion to find. And these cultures did not adapt as easily in the United States. It wasn't as easy to find other people who were already in the United States who shared these beliefs, who spoke these languages. So it made it a much more difficult adjustment to life here. And here's a pie chart you can look at that breaks down immigration to the United States and where people were coming from. So the majority of immigrants, 56%, were still coming from Northern and Central Europe, but you see these increased numbers of people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, coming from the Americas, so Central and South America, coming from Asia as well, and only a small percentage coming from Africa and Oceania, which would be Australia. So why were they coming? Well, I've already mentioned a few. There were many reasons, many diverse reasons. First of all, overpopulation in places like Europe and even in China meant there was less land for people to live on and less resources. So they came to the United States because they believed, and to some extent they were able to find more land. There was also religious persecution. The Jewish population in Russia in particular was targeted by the government, something known as pogroms. Which meant that they needed to flee or otherwise they could be killed. There was also political persecution. People who were responding against their government were being attacked by the government. People were escaping war and political upheaval that was happening in Europe. People also wanted to come to the United States because they knew they could find jobs. U.S. industry was blowing up, and so they knew they could find jobs in factories. They also knew that there was lots of farmland, so some of them hoped to find their own farms in the United States. There's also just a desire for independence. In the United States, with our Bill of Rights, you have freedom of religion, freedom of speech. A lot of other countries didn't have these rights guaranteed for their citizens. And so these immigrants wanted to experience those rights in the United States. So when they arrived here, many of them, it took weeks for them to get here. They traveled by steamship, and these steamships were crowded and unsanitary. When they got to the United States, they would have to enter through immigration stations, places like Ellis Island in New York, which is now a museum. They saw almost over 17 million who entered the United States. On the West Coast, you had Angel Island in San Francisco, California, that saw about 50,000 enter from Asia and the Pacific Islands. When they got here, they got off the boat and they faced a physical examination. They faced legal questioning, and their fate was always uncertain. You could be detained for any reason for days. It was even possible for you to be sent back, to be put back on a boat and sent back to where you came from if you didn't pass these tests, if you didn't pass the physical exam. Here's an image of what Ellis Island looked like on the inside when it was used as an immigration station. Note the lines of people who were just waiting to go through the process. Ellis Island does still exist up in New York, and it is now a National Park museum. Here's a photo of folks going through the physical exam, which would only last a matter of seconds. But again, if you were ill, if something was just looked wrong with you, you could be sent back to where you came from. So if they made it through these immigration stations, what was life like when they actually came into the United States? Well, immigrants formed tight-knit communities for support as they adjusted to life in their new home. Old immigrants would help new migrants find work. They would help them find a place to live. They would share their food. They would celebrate their culture together. I mean, it's always good when you're seeing people who share a common language and share common beliefs and things. It's great to share those ideas with folks. Once there were enough of them, they would open community centers. They would open places of worship, churches and synagogues. They would publish newspapers written in their home language. They would open orphanages for kids who came from those countries who didn't have parents or lost their parents. They even had cemeteries together so they could memorialize those who passed from their culture and from their country. And they would work to maintain language and culture while adapting to new life. This would lead to conflicts, though, with native-born or more mainstream Americans, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. But to give you an idea of what the life looked like, here's a picture from New York City back during this time period. Notice how crowded it is. And if you look more closely, you can see a wide array of languages on some of the store cloths, things from Hebrew to Italian to Russian to Polish and some other Eastern European languages. So, when the immigrants arrived here, not everybody welcomed them. And there was this rise of something called Nativism. And Nativism was made up of people who were called nativists. And nativists despised these new immigrants. They believed that Anglo-Saxon immigrants, those English and German immigrants, were superior, that they had superior culture, superior language and religion. And these nativists feared that these different religions that were coming into the country and these different religious beliefs and cultures, particularly of the Catholics and the Jews, would hurt American democracy and religion. And they also had a fear of white Americans losing jobs to immigrants. And they wanted segregated schools and public services. They thought that by desegregating, by allowing these different cultures to come into the schools and get an education and work, it would hurt American society and hurt American government. Here's a political cartoon that shows nativist beliefs in California. In an election coming up, there was a vote where the folks in California were trying to kick out the Chinese. And this one party, the Working Men's Party of California, in this image, the WPC on the leg, is trying to kick out a derogatory image of a Chinese person. Immigrants would also see signs like this, where you could go in for work and they would say, hey, help wanted, but if you're Irish, if you're Jewish, if you're Chinese, don't bother applying. You could discriminate against people like that back then and not worry about any repercussions. And there were actually laws against immigration too. For instance, in 1882, excuse me, I got the date wrong in this, in 1882, the United States passed what was known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this severely restricted immigration from China. In fact, the number of immigrants to the United States drastically fell. And this law was on the books until 1943, until World War II. In 1907 and 1908, the United States made an agreement with Japan, where Japan agreed to limit the number of Japanese who were leaving the country to enter the United States. In 1917, it became law that immigrants entering the United States had to take a literacy test. In the 1920s, legal quotas were passed. What this means is that there are restrictions on immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. A quota was a certain number that could be allowed into the country, and those numbers were pretty low. Immigration from Western and Northern Europe, though, was still encouraged. So it was just immigration from places in Eastern Europe, from Asia, that were discriminated against, and not from places like England or Scotland or Germany. Here's a political cartoon that sums up the views of these times that many Americans had, or at least enough people in the government and society had to support these laws, where Uncle Sam is standing at the door and is rejecting, blocking entry to this immigrant. So, immigrants came to the United States at a time when cities were exploding in the United States. This is something known as urbanization, the growth of cities. Most of the immigrants who came to the United States actually stayed in the cities. Why? Well, cities were cheaper, and there were plenty of jobs for unskilled laborers at a lot of these factories. In fact, in 1890, there were 2 times as many Irish living in New York City as in Dublin, which is the largest city in Ireland. So you had this kind of conflict between Americanization versus traditionalism. What this means is the governments and citizen groups wanted to start programs to assimilate immigrants, to help them blend into the United States. So you had places like settlement houses that would provide assistance in the poorest neighborhoods. One famous place was Hull House in Chicago, founded by a woman, Jane Addams. And what they would do was provide daycare, provide classes to these immigrants, classes in English, home economic skills. They would provide medical care for people who, many of them had never even seen a doctor, or certainly couldn't afford seeing a doctor. Immigrants would also form their own social groups in order to maintain their culture, and they would often live in communities by ethnicity. If in New York City you have places like Little Italy, in New York City, out in LA, you have places like Chinatown. Right here in DC, you have Chinatown. Those names came from neighborhoods where you had a lot of people of a certain ethnic group living in that community. You also had political groups known as machines who would also help immigrants in exchange for votes. So the political groups might help immigrant find a job, find a place to stay, and in return expect you to vote for their candidates. So check out this map. In 1910, it shows you in each state of the United States where the largest immigrant group came from in that state. So you notice for DC, it looks like it's a cross between around Germany and the UK, United Kingdom, where Great Britain and Scotland are. But notice for West Virginia, which is so close to us, that Italy actually had the largest number of immigrants living in that state. In the Southwest, Mexico had a large mix. But then look up in New York State, which includes New York City. Notice that Russia and what would later be the USSR had sent the most number of immigrants there. So life in the city had plenty of problems. In fact, it wasn't just immigrants who were moving to the cities. It was many Americans leaving the countryside for the cities, too. And African Americans were also leaving the South and moving to the cities in large numbers. In fact, between 1890 and 1910, over 200,000 African Americans left the South and moved to the cities for many of the same reasons that immigrants were coming to the United States. They wanted to find work. And they also wanted to escape violence and oppression from the local governments and local culture. For African Americans, it was in particular racial violence. They wanted to escape Jim Crow laws. Many of these new settlers in the city settled in what were known as tenements. These were multifamily urban dwellings, often very overcrowded and often very unsanitary. You'd have single-family apartments that would house several families. It'd be very cramped. And this meant that there was little access to sunlight, little access to fresh air, little access to clean water. And this would result in lots of garbage, and there would be an increase in crime. And fires were also a big concern because a lot of these early cities were built out of wood. There were massive fires in Chicago in 1871, another massive fire in San Francisco in 1906. Baltimore had a massive fire in 1904 to destroy good portions of the city. Here's an image of what some of the tenements would have looked like on the outside. Notice that folks are just hanging out their laundry to dry in between buildings. And here's an image of what it would have looked like inside one of these tenement buildings. Notice that how many people are in the photo. You got a very large family, and you don't really see any windows going outside. It would have been very dark. And notice this, talking about sanitation and garbage problems, you've got a few kids hanging out on the street with a dead horse that's just hanging out there. So if a dead horse is allowed to just stay out there on the street, imagine what else there would be in the city streets. So cities were undergoing massive revolution during this time. When you go to a city, you'd see amazing new things like skyscrapers. Skyscrapers were constructed because, well, land was limited in a place like New York, which is an island, so why not build up into the sky? Skyscrapers were also possible because steel had come along, and steel was very strong and flexible, and you had the invention of elevators that allowed people to access high-story buildings. You also had mass electric transit, like the predecessors to the subways, rail cars, and things like that. This allowed people to travel great distances within the cities. Streetcars in cities like San Francisco and right here in D.C., subways in Boston and New York City, L trains or elevated trains in places like Chicago would allow for people to spread out but get from point A to point B in the cities very quickly. And this would lead to the growth of the suburbs. People would actually move just outside of the city and still get to work in the cities on time and very easily. And you had people in the cities who would deliberately plan the cities so that they weren't too crazy. You had to build things like large bridges to connect cities that are divided by rivers, places like New York, Chicago, Boston, St. Louis, even D.C. The folks who were coming in out of Virginia, they need to cross bridges to get into our city. These city planners also planned parks and zoos, recreational facilities for people to go outside and enjoy and be able to relax. Places like Central Park in New York City, the Emerald Necklace in Boston, the White City in Chicago. Here in D.C., we have the National Mall and Meridian Hill Park and lots of other parks, Anacostia Park in D.C. These urban planners also built things like sewers and sanitation systems to deal with the increasing amount of garbage. They also introduced police and fire departments, organized police and fire departments to help combat crime and also to limit the risk of fire destroying cities. Speaking of mass transit, here's a streetcar from back in the day. Take a look at what it says and see if you can figure out what street it might be running on and what neighborhoods it would pass through. And then check out this photo, this aerial photo of Central Park in New York City. Notice how you have all that green space and walkways that are surrounded by these really tall buildings and skyscrapers. So what drew people to the city? Well, there was a lot of things you could do. People had more money during this time and they wanted fun things to spend it on. Things like paper products. You could buy lots of books and newspapers. Magazines were all the rage. People could go to all sorts of museums. They could go to libraries and check out books for free. They could go to amusement parks and ride rides and eat cotton candy. People also became more interested in recreational and spectator sports because they had more leisure time. People got into bicycling, tennis, baseball, boxing also took off. Department stores were these massive stores where you could go and see everything you could possibly want and more. And these department stores would reach out to people in rural areas by mailing them mail catalogs where people could flip through them and order whatever goods they saw and have them delivered to their homes. Here's the inside of the New York Public Library, the first New York Public Library. Just check out the beautiful room where you could go and get a book and just sit and read or stare at the ceiling. This is an example of a page you would see in a mail order catalog. Notice the fashion of the day. See if that's anything you would have wanted to wear. And one of the first big and really successful department stores was Macy's. Hey, the same Macy's that hosts the Thanksgiving Day Parade. And here's an image of their building when it first opened back in the 1800s in New York City. There was also a big emphasis on public education during this time, with all these people moving into the cities, and even people in towns in the countryside. States began passing laws that required education for children ages 8 to 14. And they also passed laws that established tax-supported public schools. You even had the emergence of kindergartens for younger children. They became very popular. And then high schools would be very different from the schools that you attend today. They focused on vocational classes, teaching students job skills. Classes for girls would focus on home economics, cooking and sewing and tending a home. However, even with this increase in interest in public education, access to such education for African Americans was still severely limited. In fact, in 1910, only 3% of African American children attended school, but most of them only attended private schools. Immigrants would attend in large numbers when they came to the United States. Catholics who came to the United States would establish a large number of parochial or religious schools so that their students would receive a Catholic-centered education. Now, let's take a look at higher education, so colleges and universities during this time. And it's important to note that during this time, the 40-year span from 1880 to 1920, college enrollment in the United States more than quadrupled. Part of this was because colleges were modernizing their curriculum. They offered courses in modern languages, in physical sciences, in law and medicine, more contemporary subjects. Universities were also founded specifically for African Americans. A lot of the HBCUs, as we call them today, schools like Lincoln, Howard, Atlanta University, and Fisk were among the first. By 1900, in 1900, there were only 3,880 out of 9 million African Americans who were enrolled, though, so it was still a very small number who were in college. But you had folks like Booker T. Washington who were pushing for African Americans to educate themselves. Booker T. Washington advocated for African Americans to focus on their vocational skills to empower their economic strength in the United States. Meanwhile, you had educators like W.B. Du Bois who pushed for a liberal arts education for African Americans so that they could be strong citizens and participate in civil society more easily and be considered equals of all Americans, particularly white Americans. Here's an image of Booker T. Washington. Here's an image of W.B. Du Bois. And so while both had their differences over what African Americans should be focusing on at the time, both of them supported the African American community and would have certainly agreed that that African Americans should have access to an education. Here's a photo from a chemistry classroom from right down the street at Howard University. And here's an image of the choir from Fisk University. A lot of these HBCUs would earn money for the schools with their gospel choirs, touring the United States and touring the world to great acclaim. Well, thanks for checking out this video. There'll be a quiz coming up next week. And if you have any questions, please let me know in class.